Welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. I'm Eileen O'Reilly, Treasurer and member of the Board of Governors of the National Press Club. I am also the standards editor and a science writer at Axios. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual Headliners book wrap with food writer and author Mark Bittman to discuss his new book, Animal Vegetable Junk: A History of Food from Sustainable to Suicidal. We'll get started in a moment, but I wanted to give a quick reminder that we are happy to accept your questions. We'll ask as many as time permits. To submit a question, please email headliners@press.org. To get back to the topic at hand, which is something that touches all of us, our supermarkets now teem with food courtesy of advances in agricultural productivity and efficiency. But acclaimed food writer Mark Bittman says there's a downside. It comes at the expense of the environment and our health. Bittman, who spent 30 years writing about food for the New York Times, is most well known for his now classic cookbook, How to Cook Everything, which celebrated its 20th edition in 2019. His newest book, however, takes a hard look at how we eat and talks about why, for the sake of our environment and health, we must eat differently. A recent headline in the New York Times summed it up this way: Mark Bittman cooked everything. Now he wants to change everything. In Animal Vegetable Junk, Bittman offers a sweeping history of food itself, but also takes a clear-eyed look at the catastrophic impact of modern agriculture on our climate, our environment, our health, and the world's animals. The unsparing examination of what he calls big food makes the case for a radical change in order to save the planet. His allies in that mission include former Vice President Al Gore, who calls the book a must-read for policymakers, activists, and concerned citizens looking to better understand our food system and how we can fix it. We are delighted to discuss these issues with Mr. Bittman. Welcome to the National Press Club, Mark.
Thank you, Eileen, and thanks for having me.
Of course. So I thought first we'd look at the big picture. This book is very different from your prior ones, many of which are best-selling cookbooks, often with a message or a theme. But for this one, you dedicated 5 years to this and say in the intro that it's your most serious book. And in this one, you are calling for a radical reformation of the whole food system. Can you tell us why you are doing this type of book and why you're doing it now?
Well, I still write recipes, but I focused primarily on cooking and recipes for 20 years or so. And it just became increasingly clear that there were increasing problems with our food system, with the food that we were growing and processing and buying, and how we were doing it and how it was affecting our bodies. And from 2005 onwards or so, it became increasingly clear how much impact agriculture had on climate change. And so I started to write about that, not without some resistance, but that's a different story, I guess. I started to write about that for the Times, first for Week in Review section, which later became called Sunday Review, and then in a weekly opinion column that covered all aspects of food. And my idea was that somehow through the opinion column, I would be able to do a mosaic or paint a picture of the whole food system a little at a time, 800, 1,000, 1,200 words at a time. Mm-hmm. But after 4 or 5 years of that, it was clear that that wasn't adequate. And I thought, I need to do this as a book. And I'd learned enough. I'd had enough practice writing, God knows. So I left the Times and I spent a year or two reading, and then I put together a proposal. 2016, I sort of started working on the book. 2017, I got serious, and it was published this February. I think I became increasingly interested in the history as I was going along, and it takes takes probably half the book to tell the story of how we got to where we are today.
Mhm.
And it's a fascinating history and really compelling. And it's been done before, but it hasn't been done recently, and it hasn't been done from my perspective, obviously. And I think that was important to do. The discussion of where our food system is at right now is a common one, and many writers have tackled it. It's there's not a lot new to say. Things are challenging, difficult, problematic, and so on. So the question becomes, how do we move forward? How do we get out of this mess? In that, it's very much like climate change or other things, which is we understand the problem. How do we fix it? How do we address it? And that's what the final third or so of the book is about. And that's frankly the most challenging part, and the part that changes the most often. We are moving forward. Things are changing. They've changed since I finished the book. They've even changed since the book came out. But that's good. We are in a period where it's possible, again, just like with the climate crisis, it's possible to make change. We can see what changes need to be made first, but there's a sense of urgency here that I feel is important to emphasize.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I understand that. I know different people have different definitions of big ag and big food. Can you tell us what they mean to you, and why do you say big food is largely to blame for many of our problems?
If you ask any number of people what food is for, I think their first answer would be to feed people. And then if you expand on that, it's to feed people well. I mean, food, by definition, food provides nourishment.
Mhm.
You can then ask the question, what's nourishment? And the answer to that is substance that promotes health. So by definition, food promotes health.
Mhm.
That should be our priority when it comes to food. We should be making food, nutritious food, available and affordable to everybody. That's not how the food system in the United States and in many other places in the world works. The way it works here is that its priority is to make money. In this way, it's like almost everything else. I mean, there's nothing new about that. If you talk about transportation or clothing or furniture or housing or even healthcare, almost anything you can name exists primarily to make money for its operators and owners. The service that it provides is almost ancillary. That's true of food, which is essential to everyone's life, is even more criminal than the fact that it's true of so many other things.
Mhm.
So if you big ag and big food don't really mean anything, except almost all the food in this country is produced by big ag, by which we mean industrial agriculture, and all that implies monoculture, machinery, chemicals, and so on, and is processed and distributed by big food. So it means kind of food and where it comes from.
Okay. The entire ecosystem, basically.
I mean, 5%, some small percentage of food in the United States is produced responsibly, regeneratively, organically, and so on, locally, by people who care about the food, by people who steward the land, by
Mhm.
people who sell the food directly to eaters or almost directly to eaters. There is a percentage, a growing percentage of food that is like that, but it is, I guess, not an insignificant minority, but a tiny minority.
Right, right. Okay. Um, yeah. I remember you talking about how industrial farming is more pretty looking. And that some of the old-fashioned methods, like the Three Sisters method of planting corn with squash and beans, is better. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I mean, there's nothing like driving through Iowa and seeing mile after mile, especially in June or July, of mile after mile of beautiful green corn and soybeans, so uniform, so perfectly arranged, the breeze rippling through their leaves, and so on. When you get out of the car, because no one walks, of course, when you get out of the car, you know, what you see are fields that are really dead except for that corn. You don't see a lot of butterflies or birds or other wildlife. You don't really even see bugs. And when you pick up the soil, it's kind of dry and lifeless. When you go to an old-fashioned or even a new-fashioned farm that focuses on biodiversity, that focuses on polycropping, growing many different things at once, you don't see the kind of order that you see in industrial agriculture. In fact, if you go to Mexico or other places where even the American Southwest, where the method you called rightly the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, grow together and grow symbiotically, you can go to those kinds of places and not even know that you're in a food producing area. Someone can say, I mean, I've been walked through forests to a place where the person who was guiding me said, okay, here we are. And it kind of looks very much like the forest we just walked through. It doesn't look like our notion of a farm. It looks like chaos. But the fact is that nature likes chaos, and chaos is an interesting way, not pure chaos, of course, but what looks like chaos is how nature works best, with many different species competing and supporting one another, with biodiversity, with many different life forms in the same place. And that's the way soil is kept alive. That's the way water use is minimized. That's the way things grow best. It's not the way one crop grows best using chemicals and machinery and so on, but it's the way things grow best if you're interested in maintaining soil health, if you're interested in maintaining human health, if you're interested in maintaining planetary health. The monoculture thing is only best if your prime concerns are yield and profit. Otherwise, the sort of chaotic, biodiversity, chaos is a bad word because it has, or it's not the right word because it has bad implications, but a farm that promotes biodiversity, that maintains many dozens or hundreds of different kinds of life forms, millions if you include insects, that's where farming is really at its best.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. You have called the modern food system unjust, unhealthy, unsustainable, and cruel. Can you expand on that?
If I forget one of those words, you can remind me. The food system works well. It works best for people with money. It works well for people with money. Some percentage of the food that the food system creates and supplies is healthy, reasonable, decent food. And if you can afford it and you can afford to deal with it, then you can live with the food system and be just fine. And I think that's why food gets so little attention, is that the way the food system is organized, which is, again, without much concern for sustainability, for the future, for resource use, for the way the planet might look in 10 or 50 years. Again, the parallels to climate change are right there. The way it works and the problems that it causes affect everybody. But those problems don't affect everybody proportionately. They affect people who live in farming communities, who work in farming communities, who live near farming communities, who don't have the money to buy good food or the time to prepare that good food. They affect those people more. So they can affect you in the sense that if you live anywhere near a factory farm, your odds of getting cancer increase significantly. They can affect you in that if you don't have, if you have a diet that's largely composed of junk food, your odds of getting a chronic disease go up proportionately. They affect you in that you may suffer from micronutrient deficiencies if you don't have an adequate diet. They may even cause you to go hungry, as people in the United States do. A significant number of people in the United States do. So when it comes to justice and fairness, that has not been a priority of the food system at all. This is a responsibility of government. And I think it's probably fair to say that our Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, or what we used to call food stamps, is a program that does work to some extent. It doesn't work brilliantly, but it's worth defending and worth crediting, because some countries don't even have that. But given that we're the richest country in the world, one could question why 50 million people are in need of supplemental nutrition assistance, and why there's probably another 20 or 30 million who would qualify, but who, for issues of pride or dignity or ignorance, that is, they don't know that the program exists or how to apply for it, another 20 or 30 million should be on that program and are not. But it's a question that goes way beyond food when you start to say, how can we have so many citizens, a quarter or a sixth of our citizens, who can't afford the sort of basic necessities of life? That's not just the food question. But there's another issue here, and we're going to get to it sooner or later, so I might as well start on it here, and that is the quality of food,
right,
leading to really what amounts to a public health crisis.
mm-hmm.
So let's start by saying this. COVID killed prematurely, was responsible for 300,000 roughly premature deaths last year, and probably the same number this year, maybe even more. At the same time, chronic disease kills prematurely 1.8 million or so Americans every year.
Right.
The leading driver, that's the leading cause of death in the United States. The leading driver of chronic disease is diet, and the leading driver of poor diet is ultra-processed food. And the majority of calories in the United States today are from ultra-processed food. So what's being produced is bad for us. And if we go back to that definition of food, what is food? Food is something that provides nutrition. What is nutrition? Something that promotes health. Food promotes health. Half our calories don't promote health, and in fact are closer in dictionary definition to poison, which promotes illness, than they are to food. That's a big deal, and I would call that a crisis. But part of our problem is we see crises when they're acute. COVID is a crisis. The climate crisis we don't see as a crisis. The public health crisis associated with food we don't see as a crisis, because they're gradual, they're slow. In the case of food, people are hospitalized, they die quiet deaths. They die quiet and mostly slow deaths, but they're deaths that are not preventable. No one's death is, but they are people whose lives could have been prolonged and whose health could have been maintained for longer. Climate change, similarly, the changes are so gradual that people can refer to them as weather. And unless you live in Miami, or you were in New York during Superstorm Sandy, or you're in the Southwest and you're suddenly in a place where it's too hot to farm, you don't see that as climate change. You see it as weather. So I think part of the issue here, and something that I've given a lot of thought to since finishing the book, and I don't, there are many things I don't have answers to. But one of them is, what defines a crisis? Mm-hmm. And how do we elevate something to the level of crisis? Because we were able to get a $2 trillion relief program out of the Trump administration, which was devoted to spending no money on the public benefit. We got $2 trillion from the Trump administration because COVID was defined as a crisis. To its credit, the Biden administration did that again and is trying to do the same thing for infrastructure, defining those as a crisis. And agriculture and climate change are indeed part of the infrastructure package and were even part of the COVID Relief Act. It would be interesting to see what would happen if we could define the public health problems that we're having as a result of agriculture and diet right now as a crisis and try to address them so that nutritious food for all became a priority in this country.
Have you had a chance to reach out to the Biden administration and get?
It's not like I assume I'm talking to a number of reporters and various press people here, and everyone knows that it's not always easy to get to the top levels of administration. I've had contact with people at USDA. I've had contact with various senators' offices. I've had contact with FDA, but that's not the same as directly addressing the administration and saying, how are you going to deal with these problems? Of course, I'd like to do that, but
Right.
so would many other people.
But are you finding growing support for these ideas, or?
The Department of Agriculture has been, you can only compare it with its predecessors. So some people are calling Tom Vilsack's USDA Vilsack 2, because Tom Vilsack was Secretary of Agriculture in the Obama administration, and frankly, he was terrible. He's better now, and for whatever reason, whether he's had an awakening, whether someone read him the Riot Act, whether he misread the temperature of his own department or of the administration during the Obama administration, for reasons that I'll never know, none of us will ever know, because he's not going to talk about this personally, at least not right now. He is doing a better job. He is recognizing that agriculture's impact is enormous, profound, and in many ways destructive. He's recognizing that destructiveness, that destruction has greater impact of people without money, people of color, landless people in general. He's recognizing that, and he's at least giving lip service to that. And some of that lip service was translated into action in the COVID Relief Act, and that's a good thing. I don't know what comes next. We all read, everyone in this audience and I all read the paper compulsively, I'm sure, the so-called paper. We all read news all the time, and we don't know what's going to happen. The infrastructure bill is interesting, it's tremendous, it's promising, it includes many elements of the Green New Deal, which are important to agriculture and to many other, to climate change and to many other things. We don't know if it's going to pass. So the effectiveness of this administration is right now not based as much on proposing decent legislation, but on getting it done.
Right. Yeah. What can how can individuals support these things? Like, should they reach out to their representative, or like, what do you recommend people do to try to get that included in the leaf packages?
So, I, again, assuming that I'm talking to fellow journalists here, I would say, let's treat this issue seriously. This is an interesting, from a journalist's perspective. I mean, I don't get to talk this way. I don't get to talk to audiences like this one often. So why not take advantage of that? From a journalist's perspective, I found it, and this was 10 years ago, but it's a good story, I think. I found it incredibly hard to get my editors, and this was at the New York Times, to take food seriously. there was a fundamental and underlying belief that the food system worked. And indeed, any of us can go buy a mango in 5 minutes, which is unbelievable. And yet it's pretty much true. And it's not just a mango. A mango is just an example. We can go buy anything we want in 5 minutes. So there's this sort of underlying belief that food system works. It delivers food to us. We can go get it. If we don't feel like cooking, we can go buy it. Not only that, we can have fun in restaurants and we can eat weird ingredients and have a great time and so on and so on. And there are many publications, and the Times was one of them 10, 15 years ago, that would rather just treat food that way. That food is kind of like movies. It's really fun. There's things to say serious about. There are serious things to say about these subjects, but for the most part, it's entertainment. It's fun. It's joyful, and so on. It took a long time before I found the right people at the Times who were willing to let me write about the intersection of food, climate change, nutrition, environmental destruction, and so on. And I'm sure that other people are having those same issues. So I would say to fellow journalists, work on this if you want to make a difference. To fellow citizens, yeah, I think absolutely this is still a representative democracy. Maybe we're hanging on by our fingernails, but we can have an impact on what happens, but we can only have an impact on what happens if we're active. And that doesn't only mean working for Congress people or senators or high elected officials, although I would encourage people when going to town halls, when considering new candidates and the like, to ask those people what their policy is on food. What are you going to do to improve my children's school food? What are you going to do to make it easier for the farmers market in our community to operate? What are you going to do to make sure there are supermarkets where they need to be, and so on? But I think it's equally important that people work on a micro level, and that can mean supporting local farmers markets and CSAs and so on. It can also mean taking an interest in school food, what is being served in schools, where that food is coming from, to take an interest in procurement on a municipal level. What is your local hospital, city, prison buying and serving? Where's that food coming from and what is it? To take an interest in local politicians' attitudes about food, and so on. And then on an even more micro level, to pay attention to our own diets. But in a way, that part, at least for people with money, that part is pretty easy.
Okay, good. I had somebody send in a question. They said Republicans recently raised the specter of President Biden banning burgers as part of his climate plan. When did meat become so political, and what do you think is at play here?
Yeah, I mean, President Biden does not have the power to take away our burgers. So that is, that claim and that fear is on the same level as the claim that the 2020 election was stolen. Right. But the question is a good one. I don't know exactly when meat became so political, but the climate crisis is the big issue here, because although we probably eat more meat than is good for us, it's also true. I'm not a polemicist here. I'm not a dogmatist here. It's also true that meat is less harmful to our diets than was once thought. It's probably less harmful than was once thought. But splitting the difference, I mean, climate numbers are very, very hard to pin down, but splitting the difference between high and low, it's pretty safe to say that industrial production of animals, and beef is the big culprit here, that industrial production of animals is responsible for about 10% of greenhouse gases. That's a lot.
That's a lot, yeah.
It's primarily beef and pork, and it's primarily beef and pork, and I'm not really letting other animal production off the hook because there are other environmental problems involved with chickens, and there are other environmental problems besides climate change with all animal production. But just when it comes to greenhouse gas generation, cows and pigs emit significant quantities of methane. And methane is 20 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So this 10% number, which ranges from, some people will say 2%, and some people will say 50%. So there's some number, probably a double-digit number, of greenhouse gases that are attributable, that is attributable to industrial production of cows and pigs. That is political. We are going to have to eat less of those kinds of animals. We are going to have to produce them under other conditions. And that's political, in that political means political is related to policy, and the way to affect that is through policy. So when Republicans yell President Biden is trying to take away your burgers, they're appealing to their base, and they're also trying to appeal to farmers and primarily ranchers. It's not really going to happen. But if you, to be a responsible citizen, to think about reducing our own carbon footprints, it's not unreasonable to say, what's the amount of meat that you eat, and how much less could you eat without even being uncomfortable? For most people, cutting 10% of the meat that they're eating out of their diet is not asking a lot. And even 20% is not going to make you that uncomfortable. And if you're a person who drives a Prius or changes your light bulbs or whatever, you should be a person who's thinking about cutting back on meat consumption as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think in your book, you also talk about that it's a moral obligation to how we treat animals.
Well, there's a moral obligation to every aspect of this conversation. Mm-hmm. And I'll get to animals, but let me talk about morality in general a little bit first. And there's not a lot of this in Animal Vegetable Junk. I've come to this way of thinking in the last, I think I finished the book in July, and I've come to this way of thinking so in the last year or so. Mm-hmm. More and more, there's some of this in the book, but more and more, I think we have the benefit of hundreds or thousands of years of science. Most of us actually know what facts are. We can understand that science makes adjustments and changes, but we can see where the weight of science is headed. We can see where the arc of human history is going. And we can see that there are many notions of the past that are not only wrong, but are immoral. So white supremacy, American exceptionalism, male dominance. I don't think anyone in their right mind at this point would argue that those notions are defensible. That's new. That just happened. Those are recent notions that many of us, maybe even the majority of us, don't believe in those things anymore. I think we have a moral obligation to try to convince other people that that's the case, and to act that way, to act as if humans are actually one family, that there's no superior race, there's no superior gender, there's no superior nationality. We have to work together to save the planet, to save our species, to save the ability of our grandchildren to live decent lives. Those are moral questions, obviously. When it comes to animals, this is not a new notion. Peter Singer's defense of animals is 40 years old, 50 years old. I think it's from the 60s. And he was talking about industrial production of animals. He was equating industrial production of animals to concentration camps. And that's right. When you have animals in conditions that are completely intolerable, when they're being raised as widgets, I mean, there's almost no difference between a factory farm and a factory that produces nuts and bolts, except that in a factory farm, the product happens to have a life. there's very little difference in how these things operate, and that's intentional. That's applying the scientific management studies of the early 20th century to farming. First they were applied to shoemaking industries and textile industries and so on, and later they were being applied to tool making industries and high-tech industries, and later they were applied to farming as an industry. The difference is that animals, to the extent that any living creature has a soul or is sentient or is capable of feeling, acting independently on its own, these are living creatures. And by destroying them by the billions, and this comes as a surprise to many people, but America raises and kills and processes 10 billion animals a year. We're all complicit in that system. And I think that that's a moral issue for all of us. We are not directly involved in executing them or raising them under torturous conditions, or processing them, but we're in some ways responsible for that happening. And the reason the industry wants to hide, and it does every single thing it can to hide what it looks like inside a factory farm, it wants to do that because the more of us that see what goes on in factory farms and in slaughterhouses, the less meat we're going to eat, because it makes us feel bad. And it makes us feel bad because it's wrong. And so that is, the treatment of animals right now. You can argue all you want about whether it's ethical to eat animals at all, and people do, and that's a fine argument. But even if you're on the side of, yes, we should be eating animals, humans always have, it's a fine way for us to integrate animals into agriculture and to nourish ourselves and so on. Even if you believe that, you cannot support the way that animals are being treated, killed, and processed right now.
Do you think we need more transparency into how that actually happens, or more journalism in that field? Or,
well, the journalism is tough because it's really, of course, but it's hard to get into a factory farm, and that's intentional. Mm-hmm. Transparency for sure. I've said half jokingly, because it's not going to happen anytime soon, but it's not a terrible idea. If there were webcams, if we had on permanent Zoom casts of what goes on inside of a factory farm, meat production would plummet immediately. If people saw what was happening to those chickens that they eat routinely, they would eat far less of them, or they would go out of their way to buy chickens from their farming neighbors, even if they did cost $30 each.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Whew, that's tough. I would like to, you also talk about a lot about social justice, and systemic racism is in there too. You go, as you said, you have about 2/3 of the book goes into the history. And I have to say, I personally found your spot about the Irish potato famine interesting, and I will have my mom make sure she reads that because she's all Irish. But you do talk about the impact of the evolution of food on colonialism and slavery and other historical events that have led to systemic racism in this country and others. Can you tell me a little bit more about what food has to do with social justice issues today?
I think we're talking about land as much as we are talking about food. We've talked a little bit, I talked a little bit about how, let's say, economically disadvantaged, it's such a euphemism, people without money have trouble buying good food. And that's certainly, we know that more people of color have less money than white people. So there is that. But, the fundamental basis of wealth is land. There's a limited amount of land. And we could go back 500 years and we could go back 1,000 years and talk about some of the ways that Europeans established and acted on white supremacy. But we don't have to go back that far. We can go back to the Homestead Act of 1862. And I'm not saying this is where it began, but it's a very recent and clear circumstance whose results are still affecting us profoundly right now. The Homestead Act basically took land that was appropriated, stolen, however you like to say it, from indigenous Americans, and gave it to white European males. So by giving that land almost exclusively to white European males, the Homestead Act and the land giveaways that resulted from it excluded the majority of people in the United States: women, people of color, indigenous people. That land was given almost exclusively to white men, and the wealth of that land grew, and the wealth of that land remains mostly in the hands of white men today. So that's not so much a food issue, it's a land issue if you want to split hairs, but that is a wealth issue and an income inequality issue, and that is most certainly a justice issue, and a lot of it is around not only race but gender, and people often forget that even white women were excluded from the land giveaway, and not specifically. It doesn't. The Homestead Act doesn't actually say men only. But so it was taken for granted that women would not take any of that land without their husbands. So you're looking at 150 years of supporting the distribution of land pretty much to white men. And since reparations is no longer a dirty word, you have to consider what can be done with that land to make things right. And then you're into the arena of talking about land reform, which is still sort of a dirty phrase, but it's not going to be forever, because if you want social justice, environmental justice, economic justice in the United States, you have to look a little more carefully at how land has been distributed, how it's been maintained, and what can be done with it to make things more equal, more just, more fair.
Yeah.
Sorry to depress you, Eileen.
Okay, I have a question from somebody. They said, I read an article that seaweed is starting to be fed to cows and pigs and can cut methane emissions by 65%. They are still gathering data on if that affects production or taste. Could changing what animals eat be part of the solution?
Well, it could be part of the solution. I mean, not everything I talked about was about climate change. So if you're just aiming to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases generated by animals, the easiest way to do that is to produce fewer animals. It could be that kelp reduces methane emissions from industrially produced animals, but that's hardly a solution. And then the question is, kelp is actually a decent human food as well. Are you just going to start mining the ocean of its kelp and feeding it to animals so that we can continue eating animals at the rate that we're doing? That doesn't sound like a solution to me. It sounds like a workaround that's going to cause problems of its own. You know, we have to look to some extent at consequences. I would say that eating seaweed by humans is not a bad idea. The question is, what are we eating it instead of, and how is that affecting both the oceans and land agriculture? And these are complicated questions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, the reason seaweed is being fed to people or animals at this point on a bigger scale is because people have figured out how to make money on it. The question has not been, Is this beneficial to people? Is this beneficial to animals? Is this beneficial to the oceans? The question has been, is this beneficial to me? Can I make money off of this? So often in conversations like this, people ask about the role of entrepreneurialism and individuals who are creative about finding ways to solve the problems of the food system or change the food system. And those are interesting questions, but often that entrepreneurial spirit is about how can I make money off of this current situation? And that is not, that may be solving that person's problems, but it's not so solving our mutual problems. And I think, what is it my partner says? It's really not that interesting to talk about how we solve our personal problems. It's much more interesting to talk about how we solve our collective problems.
Right, yeah. Speaking of collective problems, let's zoom out to the pandemic. So COVID-19, is a zoonotic disease that originated from animals, they believe. What are the conditions that set us up for this risk, and what are the changes we need to make in our food system to lessen that risk of another pandemic like this?
I mean, I don't know that that's, first of all, this is so far from my area of expertise that I'm just try to not sound like an idiot and answer it quickly. But I don't know that it's a food question. I do know that expanding our urban areas and our agricultural areas into forests and jungles and so on has been problematic in the generation of diseases and the discovery of new diseases. So urban planning, farming within our boundaries, in a way, isn't this question sort of like, how come there are so many devastating fires in California? It's because we just build wherever we feel like building. So in a way, I mean, I'm happy to talk about non-food issues, but the answers are often the same, which the grand scale answers and the ones that are not going to be, the problems that are not going to be solved anytime soon, even though there is a sense of urgency about them, lie in the hands of government and lie in the hands of responsible government. And we have seen so many despotic, oligarchical, autocratic governments around the world historically, but even in the last few years, that's one of our biggest goals has to be to turn that around and to have governments that are interested in the welfare of the people they're supposed to be representing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Here's another question from someone. Citing sustainability, the food website Epicurious recently announced that it would no longer publish new recipes using beef. And not long after that, the famed 3 Michelin-starred restaurant in New York City, 11 Madison Park, said it would be going plant-based. Are we starting to see real change?
What's funny is that those things happened last week, and I haven't had an interview since then that hasn't raised them. So let's see. Maybe the first question is, were those good PR moves on the part of Epicurious and 11 Madison Park? And the answer is a wholehearted yes. I applaud them. I think it's going to make 11 Madison Park an interesting restaurant. It's not a restaurant that serves a lot of people. It has a very exclusive client base, and Epicurious's power is limited as well. Note that Epicurious did not take down its existing beef recipes. It just that it wasn't going to produce new ones, which it's really hard to come up with a new beef recipe anyway, as a person who writes recipes, let me tell you. So it is not a herald of big change. Is it a move in the right direction? Is it a conversation starter? Yeah. There's no reason to criticize either of those things, but there's no reason to think that they're earth-shattering either.
Yeah. I think you mentioned you're not a huge fan of fake meat. Is that true? And why is that?
Well, I think I'm going to answer that question quickly. I'm not. although I think it's a really interesting topic.
Mm-hmm.
But when new technology, if this is new technology, when new technology is successful, it changes things. So the cell phone has changed many things. One of the things it did was made landlines more or less obsolete. So one of the things we'd like to see fake meat do, if it's successful, is to make factory farmed meat obsolete. And yet the consumption of meat, of factory farmed meat in the United States, has gone up since the introduction of the Impossible Whopper. So far, I don't think it's that successful. Second, also, if you're trying to make a better Whopper, the bar is really low because the Whopper is really terrible. So if you're trying to make something that's a little bit better than terrible, it's not that hard. And I would suggest that nature, actual farming, has already provided us with many alternatives to terrible meat, including the legume, which is the world's most important source of protein. And in fact, the fundamental basis of fake meat. So I would argue that rather than continuing to eat meat at the rate we're eating at, and adding to our diet another ultra processed food that we choose to call fake meat, I would suggest we eat less meat and we eat more legumes. That would be a better way to move forward.
Healthier too, probably.
Yeah, better in all regards.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I need to get some recipes for that.
We have them.
True. Let's see. So somebody else asked about the pandemic. I mean, the wet markets, those are mostly international. I mean, I know we have some in the US, but.
Well, let me talk about the pandemic for a second. I mean, 2020, the end of 2020, well, 2020 was really interesting. And we haven't gotten enough distance to know exactly how interesting and how much it changed things. But you had the pandemic, you had the election, and you had the uprisings, for want of a better term. And I think we've learned a lot from those things. But from the pandemic, we've learned about the fragility we saw early on a great deal about the fragility of the industrial international food system. Now, it did recover, to its credit, but people were worried. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that people discovered and saw was that regional food systems are quite robust, and that you can get a lot more of your food locally than many people thought. Mm-hmm. Farmers markets were crowded even in the early days, even back in last March and April. Farmers markets were crowded with people wearing masks and standing 6 feet apart and waiting patiently in line to buy real food, while supermarkets were trying to figure out curbside service. CSAs for this summer, community supported agriculture, in which you pay farmers in advance to share in part of their crop. CSAs sold out last year for this summer. They're selling out now for next summer. They're increasing in number, and many farmers who are regional and local farmers are actually doing well and making money for the first time. We're seeing more regional food in the emergency food system. So largely, in some part, thanks to government, but largely thanks to philanthropy and to nonprofits, NGOs, we are seeing increasing amounts of regional and local food making its way into the so-called emergency food system. That's an amazing and wonderful thing. It's kind of the first time that we haven't said to poor people, you can eat what's left over after the rest of us eat whatever we want. It's saying to poor people, we're trying to bring you fresh, nutritious food affordably. That is a big change that's directly attributed to some of the lessons we've learned from the pandemic. So from a food perspective, those are the interesting things that came out of the COVID crisis.
Yeah, that sounds like a silver lining. I mean, food deserts are a big problem in the US, especially nutritious food. There is a question. Is there any country that is leading the way in handling food production? Is there somebody we should be emulating here in the US?
I go into this in a lot of detail in the book, and there are many countries that are doing some things better. No one is doing everything right.
Okay.
So Chile has the world's most advanced food labeling laws. Really, really good. Mexico has the world's best junk food taxes. Really, really good. Japan probably has the world's best school lunch program. Really, really good. The two examples that are most interesting to me, I think, are Brazil, where I realize we don't have much time left, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but where until Bolsonaro became president, there was terrific land reform. As much land was given away in 10 years as had been given away in the whole course of the country's history, and given to people who were doing family farming, organic farming. That farming was subsidized. The results of that farming made their way into school systems and into farmers markets in cities, and also into restaurants where people could eat on a sliding scale nutritious meals 3 times a day. And that all pretty much went away when Bolsonaro became president, which shows the value of grassroots organizing and of continued people's power and pressure on legislatures. The other place I would single out is the state of Andhra Pradesh in India, which is a state of 60 million people, so not a small state, the size of most European countries, where no chemical agriculture is being promoted by the state government in a form of farmer-to-farmer education. So the villages that do agriculture in Andhra Pradesh are mostly quite small, 1,000 people or so. Farmers from another village will go into a new village and say, we can show you how to increase your yields, grow more crops, grow different crops without using expensive chemicals. Here's how. And within 2 or 3 years, that village has been converted to what they call zero budget natural farming. And members of that village are then paid by the government to go to other villages and spread the word. So the prediction from the advocates of this in Andhra Pradesh is that by 2030, the entire state will have converted peasant farming to no chemical farming, which would be the first such state in the world. So there are interesting things happening everywhere, but they remain pretty isolated, unfortunately.
But hopefully we can all learn from each other. That sounds really interesting. Yeah. So before I ask the final questions, let me take a moment to thank the organizers of today's event, headliners, co-team leaders Donna Linewand and Lori Russell, today's headliner event coordinator Alyssa Free, Club Communications Director Lindsay Underwood, Club Executive Director Bill McCarran, and of course, our wonderful team working behind the scenes here in our Broadcast Operations Center. I'd also like to tell you about some upcoming NPC headliners. On May 18th, we will welcome Indianapolis Colts linebacker and team captain Zaire Franklin, Colts owner and CEO Jim Irsay, and Colts Vice Chair and owner Kaylin Jackson to speak about the mental health initiative called Kicking the Stigma. And on May 19th, we'll speak with Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Elizabeth McGowan about her memoir, Outpedaling the Big C, My Healing Cycle Across America. We hope you'll join us for these events. And now for our last question. What was your comfort food during the pandemic?
Licorice.
Really?
Yes, I eat licorice every day. I don't know why, but I rediscovered my childhood fondness for it, and now I eat it without guilt daily. So it's as good an answer as any. Look, I eat a wide variety of food. I do not have a problem getting food. I do not have a problem cooking it. So there's something different on the table almost every lunch and every dinner. There's nothing I really turn to. It's all comforting to me. The cooking itself is comforting to me.
Oh, that's great. I love it. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And his book, it has a link on our website. And we really appreciate all of the insights you provided us. Thank you.
Thanks for having me and take care. Bye.
All right. Bye.